In this 3D spatial simulation, an incorporeal beam of light drops through a dense physical grid. It generates no friction and displaces no matter. This illustrates the classical boundary problem of interaction, the lack of a clear mechanism for how an immaterial human will exerts pressure on biological tissue. The inverse is equally difficult to map. We lack a mechanical explanation for how purely physical stimuli, like a sound wave or a chemical shift, synthesize non-physical emotive states. The universal theory of like-effectors resolves this by defining causality as strictly dimension-bound. A force can only exert pressure on a structure if both the force and the structure possess coordinates within the exact same tensor plane. This diagram maps the architecture of reality across 7 distinct orthogonal grids. These represent the primary planes of existence, ranging from the metaphysical at Q1 down through the physical, logical, and emotive planes. They are perfectly parallel, but separated by empty spatial gaps. The concept that like affects like functions as a strict topological law of spatial intersection. Reality operates as a strictly typed system. Without a specific geometric mechanism to bridge these isolated planes, the universe would remain entirely fragmented, incapable of unified action. We can observe native planar interaction in this diagram of the Q3 physical grid. 2 rigid spheres collide, transferring kinetic energy and rebound. They share geometric coordinates, allowing for direct interaction. The mechanics are identical in the Q7 emotive plane. A state of despair encounters a secondary state of despair. Because they occupy the same grid, their waveforms overlap and compound into a denser single state. The isolation principle dictates that a primary plane is entirely invisible to the forces of a different plane. A physical hammer in Q3 can swing indefinitely through a complex mathematical equation in the Q5 logical plane without disturbing its syntax. Because these planes are orthogonal, they share 0 geometric coordinates at the macro layer. Direct collision is impossible. This explains the impossibility of using physical tools to alter historical causes or rewrite mathematical logic. The forces pass through each other like ghosts. If the primary planes are completely isolated, the question remains, how does an intent formed in Q1 actually execute as a physical action in Q3? Since causality cannot occur at the macro-level boundaries, the structural integrity of the universe relies on a microscopic architecture of interaction that prevents reality from locking into isolated silos. Crossing between isolated planes happens exclusively at the level of recursive fractal depth, deep within the subplane layers. Looking at this animated diagram of the Q1 grid, we see that every primary plane contains a fractal map of all other planes embedded within its structure. Deep inside the metaphysical Q1 plane is this specific microscopic node, Q1-Q3. This node is the physical expression of the will, the intent to move, formatted within a metaphysical space. The physical plane contains its own embedded counterpart. This Q3-Q1 node represents a biological arm's metaphysical reception point, its physical readiness to accept a command from an identity. For the 2 planes to interact, they rely on an isomorphic coupling. Despite being scaled to different base planes, these 2 nodes share a mathematically identical 3D geometric signature. The immaterial will formats its raw intent into the specific geometric shape of the Q1-Q3 node. Simultaneously, the biological arm presents its structural readiness through the mirror geometry of the Q3-Q1 node. Because they are isomorphic connective configurations, the nodes join seamlessly. The force transfers cleanly across the dimensional gap. This mechanic functions like an API endpoint in software architecture. If the data types do not perfectly match, the command will not execute. Without this exact topological alignment, cross-plane force is rejected by the target plane's geometry as background noise. Mathematical identity is a prerequisite for physical action. Observe how this high-velocity fluid flow throttles its pressure to fill the delicate lattice structure without shattering it. The like-effector principle also governs the interaction between infinite force and bounded space. If an infinite Q1 force applied its total capacity directly to a finite Q3 physical plane, it would instantly vaporize the limited coordinates of that plane. Within the geometry of definition, patience represents the active, continuous calibration of infinite force against a finite threshold. The shadow matrix mechanism provides the solution to this limit problem. In this model, a boundless 3D structure representing infinite Q1 hovers above a constrained 2D grid representing finite Q3. The total uncompressed state of Q1 cannot manifest inside the restricted architecture of the lower plane. To interact, the infinite source must execute Kenosis, lowering its informational velocity so it can couple with the low-density target. Instead of entering the plane directly, the infinite structure projects an isomorphic shadow onto the exact corresponding subplane of the Q3 lattice. This shadow contains the structural outline of the infinite object, compressed into a lower dimension, where it can be processed safely. The infinite source calibrates its output to match the target's specific receiving coordinates. Absolute power cannot interact with a finite world without intense self-restraint. The existence of physical reality relies on this continuous mathematical throttling to prevent total systemic vaporization. These same topological rules allow us to navigate complex environments and resolve systemic deadlocks. Some systemic errors, known as isomorphism-exclusive states, cannot be resolved within their native plane. This dual-screen matrix maps severe anxiety. On the left, in the Q7 emotive plane, the anxiety manifests as a jagged, recursive data loop, generating constant noise. Attempting to solve this using only emotional tools often fails. Native tools within the same plane risk feeding the recursive cycle. The isomorphic override requires extracting and translating the variable into an orthogonal plane, such as the logical Q5 or the physical Q3. By shifting the problem to the Q5 plane, for example by correcting a false logical premise, the erratic data can be processed into a stable geometric alignment. Achieving structural resolution in the logical plane projects a stabilizing shadow back onto its isomorphic counterpart in the emotive plane, collapsing the failure state. Complex psychological and societal deadlocks are often mathematically unsolvable until translated across orthogonal boundaries. The topological laws of Like-Effectors scale to the ultimate macrostructure, the continuous body. A single biological cell, a human neural network, and a macro society share no visual resemblance, yet they are exact isomorphic equivalents. Despite their vast differences in scale, all three structures operate on the exact same underlying 7 by 7 by 7 fractal geometry. Because their geometric architectures are identical, the universal thermodynamic laws of vector accumulation apply equally to all of them. At the microscopic level, a cell that absorbs nutrients but refuses to excrete waste dies of toxicity. At the cognitive level, a mind that extracts information but refuses to act on it collapses under the pressure of cognitive dissonance. At the macro level, a society that extracts resources but refuses to distribute them eventually collapses under the pressure of revolution. Reality functions as an object-oriented mechanism maintained through the strict alignment of fractal subplanes. When these topological shapes match, causality flows across subplane boundaries, maintaining the operational continuity of the system.